Hello, everyone. This is Professor Keegan bringing you a video lecture for our Week 8 content on dissociation and lunacy. Um, this is content prepared for you to be viewed asynchronously according to your comfort level vis-a-vis your participation in the ongoing strike this week. So what I'm going to do in this video is kind of walk you through some of the major ideas of the assigned reading, and then I'll present you with some discussion slash writing questions for your own private viewing of the film by hook or by crook, which you should have access to via the link that I shared on Moodle. It's a little different than watching as a group. You're going to be watching on your own. So I think it's even more important to be attentive to some of the things that the reading is pointing toward you noticing in the film, since particularly Awkward Rich's piece is about the formal properties of transmasculine expressive culture and what we're kind of looking for in terms of what the film might be doing. Okay, so to get started, I want to note, first of all, that this is a section of Awkward Rich's book, The Terrible We, Thinking with Trans Maladjustment, that came out in 2022. Both works you're looking at today came out in 2022. So we're right at the forward edge of trans studies as a field when we're looking at this stuff. Should give you a good sense of kind of where the field is heading. And the chapter we're reading a portion of is called Some Dissociative Transmasc Poetics. Poetics being the way in which new meaning is created from existing forms. So the first thing I want to note is that this section of the chapter addresses the tendency in dominant accounts of trans masculine identity development. We're talking psychology, we're talking feminism, we're talking medicine, right? That there's a tendency to dismiss transmasculine identity as a coping response to gender-based trauma, particularly the trauma that female-assigned people experience under patriarchy. There's a lot of literature out there dismissing transmasculinity as just trying to escape from being assigned the position of woman inside of patriarchal structures. And that's what Awkward Rich is kind of noting here to start out with, right? So, we've talked about transness as a relation to form and why form presents a problem for transness, because if forms are fixed from the beginning, then how do you change them, right? We've talked about paranoia versus comedy as different genre approaches to this problem, but we haven't talked much about the difference between, say, trans feminine and trans masculine approaches to these questions. And Awkward Rich notes that trans femininity is often characterized as an attempt to like take over the forms that are assigned to women. So it's perceived as hostile, it's perceived as invasive and violent, right? In these sort of transphobic discourses. But transmasculinity is viewed differently, often as a maladaptation to gendered harm. So there's a kind of dismissal of trans men as, just not being able to become conscious feminists. Like if trans men were real feminists, they wouldn't transition. Instead, they would just resist patriarchy, right? So transmasculinity gets cast as a maladaptation to the forms of harm that feminism is discussing. This is all within the purview of literature that tends to be pretty transphobic. But Rich is kind of taking this up to think about, well, what are the particular forms of dismissal and transphobia attached to transmasculinity particularly? Okay. So Awkward Rich points in his work to the contradiction that trans men are really trapped in when trying to think about like, okay, trans men are trans people and are oppressed because they're trans, but maybe differently than how other trans subjects are oppressed. And this is particularly because there's a contradiction at work at the heart of transmasculine identification, right? That, there's a sort of double negation going on where trans men both are not women, right? And the whole sort of logic of transmasculine identification is about distancing oneself from that assignment. But trans men are also oppressed because they're not cis men, not equivalent to cis men. And that lack of equivalency has to do with that originary female assignment that trans men carry in their histories. And so trans men are non-women who also carry a history of female assignment. and that female assignment is attached to their oppression, but they're also not oppressed exactly like cis women are, right? So one of the weird ways in which transmasculinity as a form gets constructed is kind of a negation of a negation of a negation. And that begs the question of where the space for trans men is discursively in, say, accounts of gender oppression that are, you know, really like promulgated from a feminist perspective, right? Like, what does feminism have to say about trans men's oppression? It's hard to conceptualize, right? So Awkward Rich goes to dissociation as one strategy for kind of thinking about how trans men cope with this like double, triple, quadruple negation that is transmasculinity. And he grounds this discussion in kind of the most important cultural work representing transmasculinity, which is Kimberly Pierce's 1999 film, Boys Don't Cry. I would have you note that we're watching two films back to back about transness that released in the same year. Boys Don't Cry. Well, we're not watching Boys Don't Cry, but think about this. I decided we weren't going to watch Boys Don't Cry because, oof, it's a tough film to watch. But it's important to notice, right, that Boys Don't Cry and The Matrix come out the same year, and we're following this discussion rooted in the aesthetics of Boys Don't Cry, with a consideration of other types of thinking about gender and sexuality that get articulated over in The Matrix. But it is important to note, even though we're not watching it, because I spared you that, that Awkward Rich roots this whole discussion in the aesthetics of Boys Don't Cry with this shot reverse shot that I'm showing you here of Brandon's character splitting into two Brandons. That's sort of the moment of ultimate kind of negation of his identity as a man, right? And, you know, Awkward Rich reads this as a moment of dissociative transmasculinity. And he says that there's a formal practice of dissociation in transmasculine expressive culture, and he has questions about this, right? Is transmasculine dissociation one way that trans men have coped with being constructed as a paradox, right? Maybe not as a maladaptation to patriarchy, but as an adaptation to discourses that don't make any space for transmasculine identification outside of this sort of binary structure of gender oppression that I've talked about, right? So a coping strategy for being constructed as a paradox and a practice of transmasculine becoming and thought, right? What if it's not necessarily a negative thing that we see this tradition of dissociation, but instead a model for how to operate in the world as trans without having to be integrated as a trans subject in any one place, right? Um, so in what way does this maladaptation become a form of survival? Awkward Rich finds that dissociation is a coping mechanism, yes, um, but it's also a formal and psychic strategy for how to occupy transmasculine identifications. And it's also a precondition for those identifications. Like we might actually have to take on a dissociative consciousness to move forward into a transmasculine identification that is never going to offer an integrated experience of gender, because of how transmasculinity is constructed as a sort of series of negations that never resolve into an occupiable subject position. So, to say more, and this goes to how we've been thinking more carefully about form in class. And I have to say, the most recent journals really do show that you folks are slowing down and thinking more attentively about form and how it expresses, right? Which Marco and I have been like really pleased to see. So when we think about dissociation, we might think about how it formally manifests within transmasculine expressive cultures. And Awkward Rich gives a couple of examples of this with the archive of texts that he offers to us. He talks about Eli Clare and Elliot Deline, particularly, along with Boys Don't Cry, as texts that illustrate dissociative strategies for transmasculine subjectivity, right? And so there are a number of formal properties that dissociation has in the literature of transmasculine culture, right? one of which is disaggregation of consciousness, the breaking down of consciousness into different components that aren't all located within any one position or subject or body. Um, Splitting, I just showed you the shot, that really famous shot reverse shot from Boys Don't Cry, um, as a model for splitting, right? That there's a split between maybe in time between before and after, or a split between the girl history and the boy history, or between the child and adult selves, between being a subject or being an object, between the body and the self or the mind, or between external and internal interpretations of gender, right? That we see a splitting and splitting and splitting rather than a reintegration of a unitary subject. Doubling of self or of reality. We're about to watch a film, and this is why I wanted you to watch By Hook or by Crook instead of Boys Don't Cry, because Boys Don't Cry offers a very sort of classically Hollywood take on using formal continuity editing to produce this split. But by Hook or by Crook is an indie film that presents us with two trans men in relationship to one another that also perform a kind of doubling. But that doubling allows them to do different things. It's like Boys Don't Cry is a tragedy about the failure of Brandon to survive the splitting that realist form produces. By Hook or by Crook is a comedy about trans buddies who are able through doubling to like get away with stuff, right? So how does doubling function internal to the film we're watching by hook or by crook to allow for different kinds of reality to emerge, different kinds of relationality? There's the process of receding from a scene while still being present in it, right? The separation of the self from the body. Qualities of fragmentation, repetition, accumulation of intense sensory images, systematic citation, right? Going back to evidence over and over and over again. Particularly in this film, the character of Valentine is a character who systematically cites images, objects, has them with him all the time, is constantly like touching objects, right? Thinking about how that produces a certain kind of fractured reality where he's always creating another narrative from within the one we're in. Um, and also the refusal of tidy stories. Sorry, there's a duplicated of there. That there's no singular narrative of the self, that the self is split across many, many different kind of fragments of story. And there's no real need to necessarily integrate or no real possibility of integrating them into any one autobiographical record. Dislocatedness and fracture, right? And these are things that come from actually from the Preciado piece as well, which is written in a very kind of fractured form that I want you to think about. So a little bit more about this before we transition over to Preciado. Awkward Rich reclaims dissociation as a transmasculine art. He's saying that it's not necessarily a form of illness or psychosis, but actually an art form. And an art has its practices, right? Um, he says it's done to produce certain things. And so he says that this allows trans men to actually bridge the ideologies that construct them as impossible, right? This whole problem of like, well, I'm not a woman, but I'm also not a man according to the standard definitions of masculinity, and I'm oppressed because of my gender assignment as female, but I've also renounced that, right? Like, how does that all, how do you bridge all of those contradictions? Um, Dissociation is one strategy for that. So Awkward Rich says this is actually a form of madness or maladjustment that functions as a mode of transmasculine becoming. It's actually through being able to successfully navigate the fragmentation of the self that trans men are able to bridge and survive within these paradoxical formations that render them impossible, even as they are very real people. Awkward Rich says that this transmasculine art is an embodied capacity for survival that helps trans men cope with the lack of a discursive place in which they can exist, right? because trans men cannot really be theorized internal to feminism in any way that helps us produce an account of their gender oppression. And then the specificities of masculinity under queer theory tend to also kind of get lost in the discussion of anti-normativity, right? Like, well, if being male is the norm and queer theory is about resisting a norm, then why would anyone want to actually be a man? Isn't that just re-articulating the normal or the normative, right? So these tools we have, feminism and queer theory, don't really help us think about transmasculinity as an occupiable position. And that's a real issue for trans men, particularly, where there's no discursive set of theoretical ideas that allow us to kind of locate transmasculinity as a whole in one place. So dissociation provides a strategy for coping with that, and also provides, quote, a capacity to hold and bear plural self-images. It's not that trans men arrive at any one singular transition self, but instead are, often holding on to these pluralities, fragmented across these narratives, these dissociated narratives of gender transition, of, before and after. So to add Preciado onto this, I want to see what you make of this book, because it's new, and I think a lot of people are grappling with how broadly it gestures at the utility of an idea like dysphoria, which is a form of illness that only trans people are supposed to suffer from, and that is supposed to like render one a deserving subject of medical treatment under the protocol of gender dysphoria, right, according to medicine. But here, Preciado goes as large as possible, right? And really theorizes the madness or lunacy that trans people have been diagnosed with as really a universal condition of the present moment. It's not just that trans people are, bearing this weight of the gap between the the discourses assigned to us and the present moment, which seems to demand something very different, right? It's everybody. The old way of doing things under modernity is breaking down right in front of us, and it's producing a lot of discomfort. And so Preciado, you know, in the tradition of queer theory, we would call this a universalizing approach, takes this protocol that is assigned just to a few people, trans people, right? And says, what if trans people are just a scapegoat and really the whole world is dysphoric? And what does that mean for, the systems by which we've come to understand the world? He says that dysphoria is really the shared affective condition of the entire globe at this point, because the binary structures that we've relied on to produce and organize modernity, like man, woman, black, white, right, um, are crumbling right in front of us. And the the response to that crumbling is a certain kind of discomfort with the system as dictated. We're expected to keep upholding these forms that we can clearly see don't work, right? And there's a weird way in which the trans experience of knowing very well the forms of gender are not real is now spreading to everybody, right? So Preciado says that dysphoria is actually the name for how our available identities now fail to reenact the pure forms required to reproduce the modern, right? That whiteness, manhood, these colonial relations of owner and property, they're just not holding up. They're not real. The whole planet needs to transition, right, to a new age and new forms of knowledge production. And this is producing a crisis for people, a dissociative crisis for the whole planet, right? So I'm curious to see what you do with this reading, but it's really interesting to think about how Preciado is effectuating this argument from within perhaps a dissociative form, right? He's not only talking about our desire to dissociate from what we're noticing about the breakdown of things that used to be thought of as very real, like the gender binary, like sex, like race, right? Um, but also that he does it by using dissociative form in his writing. This is a work that's spread across three languages. It doesn't operate just in one language, right? Um, so I wanted to kind of bounce this piece off of you to see what you did with it. But I think it offers a really interesting, in the same year, articulation of some of what Awkward Rich is saying about dissociation as a formal practice. Uh, so, um, I'm not spending a ton of time on this. I would love to see what you think of it. I will say that this is one of my favorite films in the class, and I really hope you enjoy it. Um, Harry Dodge and Silas Howard are still out there making work. They're a little older than I am. And Harry Dodge has written some incredible novels. Silas Howard has gone on to direct a lot of the television you've probably seen if you watch queer and trans television. Um, but this is their first kind of film together, and it's such an incredible work to come along in the wake of Boys Don't Cry, offering a different way of thinking about trans masculinity that isn't tragic, that's still fractured but not tragic, right? Um, so a couple of questions here for you to think about in your journal, right? Um, we're practicing reading form, right? So we could think about how the film advances formal properties of dissociation, um, and also how it's enacting a sort of transmasculine art. There are a lot of scenes where these guys pull off capers that require a certain kind of artistry. So I'd be asking you to look carefully at those scenes and think about dissociation as a strategy, an artful strategy for getting away with things, sort of right under the noses of people. Um, and then not also the getting away with things, but also on top of that, right? What becomes possible because of the praxis of that art aesthetically and narratively in the film? What does it allow them to do together and also, you know, for each character? Um, and lastly, to bring Preciado in, we could think about how the film democratizes dysphoric or lunatic positions. How does it invite us into its craziness? And how does it help us see the systems in place as systems that one can only be crazy in response to because of how they normalize things that should not be normalized. Um, so really excited to see what you think of this film, which I'm sure a lot of you haven't seen. It's not widely available. It was just finally picked up by Criterion. Um, and a lot well less known than Boys Don't Cry, but offering very different aesthetic strategies than the ones Awkward Rich is talking about, although in the same tradition, probably, right, of transmasculine dissociative art. So I'll leave it there. I hope you have a great week. Um, Feel free to view this video on your own time and complete the journal after the strike ends if you'd like to. Okay, bye.